In the first video of this series, I gave a breakdown of the fundamentals of Final Fantasy XIV's combat so that you would know what you needed to do when you encountered enemies. You may have noticed something about this game though. Yeah, this bit, the online bit. It is, after all, a massive multiplayer online game, an MMO, so you'll be playing with other people as part of a team. It would probably therefore make sense for me to explain what your roles and responsibilities are in such a team. There are three basic roles in this game: tank, healer, and DPS. Enemies are going to be mad that someone's hitting them, and they're going to want to punch someone in the face. A tank's job is to make sure that that someone is them, by keeping aggro on all enemies at all times. They have innately high defense and a collection of buttons that reduce the damage they take. A healer's job, not surprisingly, is to heal, most often the tank on account of all the aforementioned punching in the face that they get, but also themselves and some DPS if they take some unavoidable damage, such as a raid wide from the boss, or if someone does an oopsie and stands in, an explosion. DPS, which is an abbreviation of damage per second, are the damage dealers of the party. They basically hit things really hard and make them dead. It's also worth noting that tanks have the responsibility of positioning and facing the boss. Typically, the party will want to stand behind a boss, with the tank in front facing it away, because a lot of bosses, and even some more minor enemies, cleave, that is to say they attack an area in front of them. So to avoid the rest of the party taking unnecessary damage, they will group up together behind. Party members will also want to avoid straying too far from each other when they group up like this, since if they wander off too far, then they might find themselves outside of the range of certain heals or buffs that their party are throwing out. Next, let's talk about the types of parties and content that are in this game. Broadly speaking, there are three types of parties for multiplayer content. Firstly, we have light parties, which consist of 4 players, 1 tank, 1 healer, and 2 DPS. And this is the configuration that's used for dungeons. Full parties consist of 8 players, that is, 2 tanks, 2 healers, and 4 DPS. This is the configuration for duties more focused around a singular boss fight, such as trials and raids. Lastly, there is multi-party content / alliance content. This consists of multiple 8-man parties all fighting together in a single instance. Examples of this include 24-man alliance raids and side content such as Bosja. Dungeons are the most common type of duty that you'll encounter, and your very first multiplayer instance in the main story will be a dungeon. They are typically structured so that you fight a bunch of weaker enemies and then fight a boss, and then you rinse and repeat this another 2 times. Trials are the next most common, and they are basically self-contained boss fights. They are typically used for some big story beats during the main quest. One thing to note is that some of them are labelled as hard versions in early parts of the game, but don't be intimidated by these. They are basically a way to distinguish mildly more complex reskins of fights you've already done, but they're very much casual difficulty. They completely dropped this naming scheme in future expansions, I think because of the confusion. Normal raids are optional side content with their own storylines that you can access at the end of each expansion. These are mostly self-contained boss fights too, although some of the early ones are kind of weird and function more like mini dungeons. They were very much finding their feet for what they wanted these to be early on in this game's history. Alliance raids are much like normal raids, an end of expansion optional side content thing with their own unique stories. The main distinction being that they are 24-man rather than 8-man. High-end duties exist for those that are seeking more of a challenge. These are usually upgraded versions of normal fights that are tuned to be more difficult. Extremes are the entry point here. These are usually moderately harder versions of trials that you've already done. Above that are savages, which is where you start to see some of the seriously difficult fights get introduced into the game. In order to beat these, you will need to know your job and the fight quite well. And at the very top, we have ultimates. These are 15 to 20 minute long encounters that are usually an amalgamation of fights from either an expansion story or a Savage Raid series. It's not uncommon for groups to take months to beat these, since they require near perfection for their entire length and require execution at a much faster pace than other content. These are some of the hardest fights in modern MMORPGs and, unsurprisingly, only a small fraction of the player base ever gets around to beating them. Now that we have a better idea of what sort of duties there are in this game, next we'll cover how to get a party. There are 2 main ways of getting a party in this game. You can either queue in using the duty finder and then get randomly matched with other people that are queuing, or you can create a pre-made party and then queue in. For most main scenario stuff, you'll be fine getting matched randomly in the duty finder. DPS queues tend to be the longest, since the most people play DPS, with healer queues usually being the shortest. You can partially pre-make a party, say by having a friend join you, and then duty finder will recruit for the remaining spaces. This can be nice for getting quicker queues as a DPS, since you can, for instance, have a healer friend come join you and queue in with you. Therefore, you won't need to recruit a healer, and your queue will be much quicker. You can invite people directly from the friends list, or by finding them in-game. Free trial players won't be able to send friend invitations or party invites themselves, but can accept them from other players. This can be a little bit annoying if you and a friend were planning to go through the free trial together. There is, however, a workaround. If you can get a subscribed player to invite you both into a party, and then that player leaves, you and your friend will be left in a party together, which means you can then queue into an instance together. Whilst not ideal, it's a good enough workaround, and the community is generally pretty accommodating to helping free trial players out with this sort of stuff. Whilst Duty Finder is normally sufficient for your party making needs, there will be times when it falls short. For instance, if queue times are really long. In these instances, you may have better luck with Party Finder. Party Finder is basically a public recruitment listing that you put up for a duty, and then people can join on any of the jobs that you list. This is primarily used for high-end raiding, but it does have some use cases, like the aforementioned long queue times, or if you want to do something unusual, like an alliance raid, but with only tanks. I can personally recall using it when it was like 3 AM and I was going through the story of the current expansion, and I got to the story finale fight, but because it's 3 AM, queues were completely dead. However, you pop up a party finder, people are always willing to help people get through the story. It filled and then able to queue instantaneously. Regardless of which method you use to form your party, there will be some settings that you can tweak in the Duty Finder before you end up queuing. The Join Party in Progress option lets you join a group that's partway through a duty. So for instance, if a party was on a dungeon and one of the players DC'd and wasn't able to come back, then maybe you fill in for that party. Unrestricted Party allows you to ignore standard party composition requirements. It also allows you to over-level and over-gear a duty if you have level sync toggled off, since normally you will be synced down to an appropriate level and gear strength. Minimum eye level and no echo are toggles to make content more difficult. Explorer mode is what it sounds like. It's a non-combat version of going through an instance. It's great for taking screenshots and the like. Roulettes are basically daily queues that put you in certain types of duties for a variety of rewards, such as bonus experience. The limited leveling roulette option restricts which instances you can get to a level appropriate one for the lowest level character in your party, if and only if you are completely pre-made. So you're looking to queue into your first dungeon. What can you expect? In general, Final Fantasy as a community is very welcoming to new players. You'll get people waiting for you to finish cutscenes. If you ask for advice, people are generally pretty happy to help out, and people won't get mad at mistakes when you make them. It's not like WoW, where it's reasonably common to get flamed and kicked if you mess up. That said, I would say there are still some general expectations of you. For starters, you should have reasonable gear, particularly on tank. For this, I would recommend doing Hall of the Novice to get your gear before the first dungeon. Main scenario quests and class or job quests can give you some gear, but Hall of the Novice gives you a full set of solid gear if you complete all of the missions for a specific role. You'll also get an experience boosting ring. A note of caution, however, a lot of the advice from Hall of the Novice is very outdated, so I wouldn't actually take any combat tips from it. After A Realm Reborn, the main scenario quests get a fair bit better about giving you gear. You can also spend Allagan tomestones that you earn from roulettes to purchase strong gear from vendors. Beyond that, try to interact with your job's toolkit and use AoE on 3 or more targets. To add to this, make sure to complete class and job quests as you level to unlock your new abilities. These quests can be found here underneath the main scenario quest prompt. For more role-specific expectations and tips, I'll be covering that in more depth in their own respective videos. One additional tip for new players when it comes to dungeons. The non-boss enemies, often called trash, are much scarier than the bosses. You know that meme question about would you rather fight 1 horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses? 100 duck-sized horses is definitely much scarier. This will mean you'll want to use your strong cooldowns on trash, unless like they're literally about to die, and not hold it specifically for bosses. This is probably one of the most common mistakes I see from newbies and even some more experienced players that are more on the casual side. When it comes to boss-focused duties, such as trials, the broad expectations are much the same. Have somewhat reasonable gear, try to use your ship's toolkit, etc, etc. Meeting these expectations is sufficient for normal story-based content. As you try to get better at the game though, perhaps dipping your toes into harder content, there are a couple of concepts that you'll want to familiarise yourself with. Namely, I'll be talking about aligning buffs and openers. In the previous video of this Beginner's Guide series, I introduced the concept of damage buffs. I also noted that these buffs stack multiplicatively. So for instance, a 10% buff would boost 100 potency to 110. Another 10% would boost this 110 to 121. And a further 10% would boost this 121 to 133. In comparison, additive stacking would yield 130 potency. Buffs, however, are not only applied to oneself. Some buffs are placed on specific party members, whereas others, normally called raid buffs, are applied to the entire party. What this means is that you and your party members will typically want to apply all buffs at the same time to maximize the multiplicative bonus, and then spend your most powerful attacks under these buffs. This is typically referred to as buff alignment. You might be wondering, when should I use raid buffs? How will I know when my teammates are going to use their buffs? How on earth do I coordinate with them so that we both use our buffs at the same time? The answer to this is openers. An opener is a specific order of actions that you press at the beginning of a fight for a job so that everybody's raid buffs come out at the same time. Some of you might remember from the last video that as a general rule, we want to use cooldowns as early as possible into a fight and then as soon as they recharge in order to maximize usages. So easy, right? We just use everything as soon as the boss is pulled. Well, not quite. The more observant amongst you might have noticed in the last video that Dragoon got a 10% buff from the second hit of its combo, Disembowel. So if a Dragoon player wants to maximise the buffs that they stack, they will want to wait until at least the second GCD before sending everything. This concept applies to other jobs as well. Warrior, for instance, gets a buff after the third hit of its combo. Different jobs require different amounts of setup, but as a general rule, parties will usually want to use their raid buffs after their third GCD. This principle of setting up, using raid buffs, and then unleashing all of your burst damage under buffs is what an opener tries to achieve. It maximises damage for the entire party, whilst also getting important skills on cooldown as quickly as possible. Furthermore, since raid buffs have been homogenised to all be 2-minute cooldowns in Endwalker, and most jobs work on either 1-minute or 2-minute rotations for their burst, this means that if everybody presses their buttons as soon as they come off cooldown after the opener, then at the 2-minute mark, all the buffs will be aligned and then all the big hits will fall under these buffs. The same is true for the 4-minute, the 6-minute, 8-minute and so on. The specific openers for specific jobs will have to wait for their respective guides, but to give an example, let's give a broad overview of Dragoon's opener. We can see that Dragoon does the first 2 hits of its combo to set up its 10% buff, and then double weaves some selfish buffs in the form of Lance Charge and Dragon Sight. After the third GCD, it sends out Battle Litany, which is its raid buff, and this is the same timing that other raid buffs would be coming out based on other people's openers. The reason for doing the selfish buffs before Battle Litany is because they are longer, they will fully overlap in time with Battle Litany. You can see this at the bottom here. After the fourth hit, it's basically a bunch of weaving damaging OGCDs between combo GCDs, all trying to squeeze them within the window that Battle Litany and other raid buffs are up. The only ability that isn't used in raid buffs is Wormman Thrust, but that's because it takes some loops of the rotation to gain the resources to spend it, so you can't do it any earlier. As a brand new player, you don't need to worry too much about openers and buff alignment. Raid buffs don't start appearing until level 50, and it's only really at level 70 where most jobs have their raid buffs. It's also not at all necessary to complete story content. In fact, a fair number of people that you meet in Duty Roulette won't even do buff alignment correctly at all. I bring it up here for 2 reasons. Firstly, it is a guiding star for good fundamental play in this game. Sure, in casual content it will mostly just make stuff go more smoothly. If, however, you have any aspirations for doing challenging content, high-end raiding more or less requires it. It is a core concept of Final Fantasy XIV's combat, so any improvement in play will necessarily have to account for it. Secondly, a lot of discussion about how to play specific jobs, well, requires understanding this terminology. Most online resources will assume you know what these terms mean when giving out advice. Consider this and the discussion in the previous video as a primer for the upcoming job guides in this series. And that's all for today's video. Hopefully you have a better idea of how 14's multiplayer actually functions, as well as what to expect and what is expected of you. If you found this guide useful, then please leave a like. If you have any questions or think that I missed something, comment down below. Next up in this series, we'll be doing some role-specific guides to discuss each role's fundamentals. If that sounds of interest to you, be sure to subscribe and catch them as they come out. With all that said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.